Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nina, and I'm the Associate Director of Learning and Interpretation at the Smith College Museum of Art. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's program with Danielle Carrabino, SCMA's Curator of Painting and Sculpture, and Art Conservator Valentine Talland. Today's program is being presented in conjunction with SCMA's exhibition Brought to Life, Painted Wooden Sculpture from Europe 1300 to 1700, which is on view currently and up through August 6, 2023. We will share a link through the chat so you can learn more about that exhibition, and if you're in the region, come and see it. Before I turn it over to our wonderful presenters, I have just a few quick logistical notes. Today's conversation will run just about an hour. We will be taking questions throughout the program, and Valentine and Danielle will answer those. You can actually just send those through the Q&A, and they'll answer them as they come in, and also have some time at the end to take any additional questions. So you can do that through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar. If you have any technical questions or need any assistance, please send questions along through the chat feature. You can also chat me directly, and I will help you as best as I can. Live captioning is also available during this program and can be turned on or off through the live transcript button on the bottom of your navigation. That button has a CC on it. Finally, you can adjust the size of the slideshow and video of our presenters today by dragging the horizontal bar that you'll see across the screen. It usually has a little white piece in the middle. You can make either the slideshow bigger or the presenter's video bigger in case you want to see one or the other. The presentation today is also being recorded and will be made available on the museum's website and YouTube channel. I will also mention to those of you who are in our region that we actually have another program coming up this Saturday, December 3rd, with our curator of contemporary art, Emma Chubb, who will lead a tour of the galleries exploring the relationship between bodies and abstraction. And I will share the registration link to that program in the chat. We would love to see you there and at other upcoming programs, and invite you to visit the SCMA website or join our mailing list to stay up to date with happenings at the museum. With that, I would love to turn things over to Danielle and Valentine to get this program started, and I thank you all so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Nina.
Thank you, Nina.
There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Carrabino. I'm the Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the Smith College Museum of Art. This program is related to my current exhibition, which Nina mentioned, Brought to Life, which features 16 sculptures, 10 of which are from the SCMA collection and 6 of which are from nearby institutions on loan. The focus on painted wood sculpture comes out of my desire to think carefully about the choice of materials as they relate to the function and reception of these sculptures. Wood itself was once a living material, and one of the reasons it was chosen as a support was due to its associations with the natural world. In the hands of specialized workshop artists, this wood was carved and then painted and sometimes gilded, or gold was applied to the surface. These sculptures were often part of larger multi-figural altarpieces, and their function was mainly devotional. People addressed their prayers to these sculpted saints and holy figures, often in spaces dimly lit by natural light or candles. As the light played upon the surfaces of the carved and gilded sculptures, they took on a sense of life. Like other living things, these works age and change over time. In many cases, the paint and the gold has worn off, or the sculptures were repainted, in some cases multiple times. However, unlike in other areas of art conservation, these paint layers were not removed, but become part of the work of art. Given this conservation history and the fact that the sculptures are all removed from their original context, it's difficult to determine their original appearance. This is where conservators are crucial in helping to fill in information about these objects. With that, I'm delighted to introduce Valentine Talland today. Valentine has an impressive and extensive career as an objects conservator. She has been a thought partner since the early stages of this exhibition, and her work has provided us with so much insight into these sculptures, as you'll hear today, and the art of painted wood sculpture in general. Before we begin our conversation, I will ask Valentine to please introduce herself.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you all who are attending. It's a pleasure to be here. As Danielle mentioned, I've been a conservator of sculpture and decorative arts for a number of years, a number of decades, and most recently had the privilege of assisting on this exhibition as a contract conservator for the care of 4 of the sculptures in the exhibition.
Thanks so much. So just to kind of dive into it, if we could have the next slide, please. We have some installation shots of the exhibition. My screensaver behind me is also the exhibition as it appears now. You'll see in this slide an image of the falconer on the right, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And if you'll advance, please. That's one of the sculptures we'll discuss. And then in the far right, there are 2 sculptures. One is in a case. That's the Ursula. We'll get much better close images of these in just a moment. And on the wall, you'll actually see a replica of one of the sculptures that is in the exhibition as well. Next slide, please. And finally, this slide in the center is the circumcision. So one of the main things that I wanted to focus on in this exhibition is the crucial role played by art conservation. As I said, we know so little about the history and provenance of these sculptures, but the sculptures themselves hold so much information about how, when, and where they were created. So I was wondering if I could ask Valentine how your work as an objects conservator informs us about these sculptures, and what can we learn about painted wood sculptures from your examination?
Thanks, Danielle. If we could have the next slide, please. So this is actually an image from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum of a group of museum professionals looking at another painted wood sculpture that's in the permanent collection there. And just by way of note, I worked at the Gardner Museum for many years, and some of my former colleagues helped collaborate on the Smith project as well. And I chose this slide because it's got a group of curators and conservators all doing the same thing, which is looking very closely. Part of what all of us in art museums do is spend a lot of time looking, but we might have different objectives for the kind of looking that we do. For conservators, we're really focused on trying to identify what's healthy about a sculpture. And specifically by healthy, what we're trying to identify is whether there are signs of damage or whether there are particular conditions in the sculpture that are going to compromise or impact the long-term preservation of the work. And a lot of that we can determine just from visual examination. And that's always the place where we begin in the study of a work. The other thing that close looking can do is tell us a little bit about what past or prior observers and keepers of this sculpture might have been interested in. Often we talk about that in terms of prior restoration. And that actually became a key point of conversation for Danielle and me in thinking about these sculptures. If we could have the next slide, please. Just by way of kind of very high level discussion of what these sculptures are kind of all about, as Danielle mentioned, they are made of wood. Wood we refer to as the substrate of the object. And the wood was indeed at one time living. In fact, sculptures are generally made of wood that has been seasoned, so wood that hasn't been living for quite a while. And then further to the decoration, it looks like they're just painted, but in point of fact, there's quite a complex arrangement of layers of materials that support the paint. So immediately above the wood, if you look at this illustration here, you will see that there's a thin kind of yellow beige line that's described as the glue layer. Glue is applied to kind of seal up the wood and make the wood surface ready to receive the next paint layers. Otherwise, they would all soak into the wood and they disappear. So above the glue or sealant layer, we have a layer of gesso. Gesso is specifically an Italian word, but it's been used in English and most sort of Western European languages to describe a preparation layer that usually contains a kind of white chalky material and other binders like glue or oil. The white is critical because it's going to serve as a surface to both reflect light as paint is hitting the painted, as the sun is hitting the painted sculpture. But it's also white because immediately on top of it, it's where the artist might apply drawing, or what we call underdrawing. And that's the design for what's going to happen in the paint layer. And then above that, we finally get to the paint layers. There may be more than one, and more than one in the original paint treatment. And then finally, for most of these sculptures of this time period, there will be a varnish layer, and varnish is a protective layer. It's usually made of a natural resin, which interestingly usually derives from another tree. So it's kind of a sandwich of tree on the bottom and tree on the top, and then a lot of complicated man-made materials in between. So that's what polychrome or painted sculpture is about if looked at in cross-section. Next slide, please. So in this exhibition, one of the 4 sculptures that I worked on that came from Smith was this really interesting relief panel of Saint Ursula and her attendants. And as the description says, it's carved wood and it has paint and also metal leaf or powder. So metal leaf and powder is frequently applied to these sculptures because it's bright and shiny and sparkly, and it imparts, as Danielle mentioned earlier, a real vividness to the sculptures when they're illuminated by candlelight. And it also signifies the value and importance of these sculptures to the people who commissioned them and who looked at them. So we would begin as a conservator and curator as looking really closely at this painted surface, the front, but next slide, please. Equally important, particularly to the conservator, is looking at the back, because in the back we can learn a lot about how this thing was made. Obviously, we can see the wood grain that helps confirm that we're looking at wood. But the other thing about the back that was immediately apparent is that there were 2 cracks essentially in the panel. One is a crack circled in blue that is actually a join. That is, the artist constructed a bigger panel out of smaller panels so he could make a relief as big as they wanted. And I'm saying he because in all probability it was a he. Circled in yellow is actually a crack. That's damage that's happened during the life of this sculpture. And you can see when we look at the base, the blue circle circles a very clean line. That's the join that the artist made. The yellow circle circles a kind of radial pattern, and that shows us that that is actually damage. It may be naturally occurring, or it's probably the result of some kind of impact that the sculpture received. Next slide, please. When looking at the paint, one of the things that we're particularly interested is what's its condition and where has it been damaged, or where are there losses. And this slide just illustrates, circled in green and with some details that relate to those areas, specific areas of loss. Why is that important? Well, one, it probably is a reflection of the use of this sculpture. Danielle may talk about this more, but these objects weren't just something that people looked at. When people were worshiping these, laying the hand on to the image of the saint was part of the religious experience. And so frequently we see areas of paint loss that could be evidence of the use of the piece. Next slide, please. When we look at these same areas under ultraviolet light, which is what you're seeing here, one of the things that's interesting is that we see all those areas of loss being highlighted as kind of bright white or sort of greenish white. That tells the conservator that this sculpture actually has experienced damage, but has also experienced care, because all of that bright white fluorescence is wax, and wax was typically used for centuries to help maintain and restore these sculptures. Next slide, please. Another aspect about looking about loss is it tells us a little bit about taste. These sculptures were frequently painted either in total or selectively. Sometimes crowns or faces were painted. And in this case, the whole background also got repainted, because what we can see in the image on the bottom is in the top area, there's a little island in the paint under which is a kind of pale red. That was the original color of the steps on which the saints were resting. But at a later time, somebody repainted it in what's called a faux bois or faux marble pattern, trying to make it look fancier than originally. So clearly it's an indication that somebody cared a lot about this piece and wanted to make it look kind of special, more special. Next slide, please.
Okay, so thank you so much. I feel like there's so many things that we can continue to talk about, but we'll leave that for the Q&A section, hopefully. So when we first began this project a few years ago, you and I selected 4 sculptures that would be in the exhibition for you to conserve and analyze. And we see them here on the screen. So at top left, we've already talked a little bit about the Ursula and her Virgin martyrs. To the right of that is the falconer. And to the right of that, the circumcision, and then in the lower left corner is the Saint Fiacre. So these are the 4 works that you examined. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why we chose these, why we ended up selecting these 4 out of the 10 from the SCMA collection, and explain your work on each of them, please.
My pleasure. And I just noticed in the chat that there's been an invitation to ask questions. And please do feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A. Danielle and I are both monitoring that. So if things come up, we're happy to, I am particularly happy to be interrupted and to answer questions as they occur to you. So if we could have the next slide, please. So I'm going to focus a little bit about why we chose each of these 4 sculptures. In the case of the Ursula that I talked about previously, we chose that one because it's very vibrant, very colorful, and we knew that there would be a lot about the paint that would be of interest. And we can go back and discuss a little bit more about the specifics of that. But in contrast, I was especially interested in this piece, the circumcision, for a number of reasons. But I mean, first and foremost, the thing that I think is immediately obvious is that it is not painted. Oh, this is great. So from David Dempsey, question, is there any indication that this piece was painted in the past? So there was very little, but there was some. So as you remember in an earlier slide, I talked about how the wood was sealed with glue before the paint was applied. And that is to prevent the paint from being absorbed into the wood. But as is true for many natural materials and for human applied materials, that sealing coat is not perfect. And so in point of fact, there are places on this sculpture where the gesso had managed to penetrate through and under that glue seal. And so we were under a microscope able to see in the wood grain, embedded into the wood grain, some indication that there had been a gesso. And the assumption is, and I think it's a reasonable assumption, that there would only have been a gesso if there was also paint. Gesso is not a presentation material. It's not meant to show. It's like the petticoat of a sculpture. So I feel pretty confident that it was at one time painted. But here's one of the big challenges with these, which many of you may already be aware of. At different points in history, taste changed a lot. And in particular, kind of around the Victorian era in the 19th century, there, at the same time that people were lauding and marveling about the beautiful, white, pristine classical sculptures, which we now, of course, know were not white. They were vibrantly colored, painted, and decorated. But the aesthetic of this period was really all about the form, the shape, the contours of a sculpture, not about surface decoration. And so collectors were interested in pure sculpted forms without the distraction of paint. And restorers, so precursors of my profession, were encouraged to be extremely effective in stripping off paint. And the term that got used was pickling, and it's used in household wood care today, but it really is an aggressive chemical and mechanical technique of removing all the paint. And that is exactly what's happened here. And we see some of that, the signs of that paint stripping and the kind of desiccated surface of the wood. So I would say that one of the other things that this object is really good at showing is not only a kind of virtuoso hand in carving. It's a beautifully carved piece. And in fact, I've shown a little detail on what the difference between an unfinished carved side of this and the lower right, you can see the chisel marks, or what's called chatter of the chisel in the rear, but on the front, you can see these beautiful modeled surfaces and the drapery of the figures. So that's one thing that we can see in this unpainted or paintless, let's call it, sculpture. And the other thing that we can see is the passage of time, and that human taste is really variable. And despite that, these sculptures, which started out as being representations of real, actual saints or God, end up being representations of kind of the human mastery of the human form. I was particularly interested also in this piece because it has, because the paint has been removed, it provides really good access to understanding the history of restoration and recarving of the piece. If we could have the next slide, please. Oh, I'm going to pause for a second because there's a question about the country of origin of pieces. Danielle, do you want to address that?
Sure. So that's a great question. In some cases, we don't know. In this case, we think it's Flemish, and there are a few clues that we can use to determine that, one of which is just simply the style. We can use works about which we know a little more and just compare them and see a kind of similar aesthetic. And the other one is actually the type of wood. So in some cases, for example, the French works tend to be either walnut or oak. The Flemish works also often are walnut or sometimes oak, sometimes lime wood. Lime wood tends to be the most common type of wood, so that one's a little bit more difficult to pinpoint, but that was the preferred wood in areas of what's today kind of southern Germany. So It's not an exact, for what I do, it's not an exact science, but Valentine is actually really helpful that way because she's able to kind of look at the wood. So maybe I'll pass that question to you as well, and kind of together we can usually figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who are really specialists in wood ID, and there are ways of taking tiny samples and doing wood characterization. As Danielle mentioned, there's kind of a finite repertoire of woods that are used in this. That the first piece, the Ursula, was almost certainly lime wood, and that would be expected for something of that. And then in terms of oak, a visual examination is pretty effective in that too. We're going to see actually, though, that even within the same species of wood, you can see a lot of variations, which I'll show in just a minute. But I wanted just to, well, actually, this is a good one too, for that matter, to show that, because I wanted to focus on the this head of this figure. Because first of all, one of the things I was really struck by is that it has a slightly different color than the cloak into which the neck is inserted. Also, if you look really closely into the collar of this figure, you will see that there's a slight kind of like a garroted line, which is, I know, grim, but it's exactly what it looks like. And that looked to me like it was most likely a join. If it had simply just been a join and the wood colors were consistent from the head to the figure, that would be kind of simple. This does not necessarily mean this is a restoration. It means that the head was probably carved separate from the figure and inserted. And I think in this case that it was probably original, and I'll show you later why I think it was probably original. That is, the artist chose to carve these in pieces and join them. That's very common in these. It's hard to get a single piece of wood that is the shape and size to do everything. That said, it is a point of vulnerability. Earlier, I said what's healthy about these sculptures. Well, this isn't the healthiest part. It's a weak part in the sculpture. And it clearly has a history of breaking, because when we look at the back, which is the center slide that you're looking at, you can see a kind of smear of material. That smear of material doesn't look like wood. And in point of fact, when we looked at it under ultraviolet light, which is the rightmost slide you're looking at, you can see a range of bright kind of green fluorescence. That's an indication that there are repair materials. In this case, it was a combination of wax and natural resin materials that were used to repair this. So being able to see this history of the piece because no paint is there is really helpful. And if we could look at the next slide. The other thing that having no paint there offers all of us is an opportunity to look at the sculptor's hand or handiwork. Sometimes we just refer to, when we're talking about the work of an artist, their hand. And in this case, what Danielle and I were both able to see is more than one hand. So these are two heads from the same object. On the right, the one we were looking at before, and on the left, a wood in the same species, but a completely different color, kind of a dark brown instead of a sort of yellowy color. And also, what I think is most important is stylistically a very different approach to how to carve the features on the face. Whereas in the right, you can see this careful addressing to the recess of the eye socket and then the raising of the eyelid. There's actually even a pupil carved into the eye. And on the left, it's pretty, but it is, I think, fair to say, far simpler and a little kind of cruder in approach. There's an effort the artist has made to kind of identify that there's a brow and a slight recess into the eye socket, but basically the eyes are kind of these two almond-shaped carved ellipses that are just put in relief, and it's just a very different treatment of the human form. And not only is it interesting from the perspective of understanding taste and style and changes, but it also gives us some insight into what a master carver of this period of time was able to do when working at the highest level of the art form, of the genre.
Valentine, sorry, if we can just pause here for a moment before we go on. We have a question about the wormholes. Excuse me. And the person is asking if it's just damage or if it is actually helpful in dating, like Crackler might be, to talk about the date of paintings.
That's such a good question. So yeah, first of all, in the case of these sculptures, it's really great when you see wormholes because it's an indication that the wood is probably pretty old. These are not active wormholes for the most part. These are, and they're the exit hole of the larva that's eating its way out of the wood. It only wants to eat its way out of the wood when the wood is young and healthy and has nutrients. So most of these are artifacts of the past, but that's a good sign that it's old. Now, it is possible that in the 19th or 20th or 21st century, a modern artist could find an old piece of wood and carve it and try to kind of trick us into believing that it's a historic sculpture. But when that happens, the wormhole pattern is usually not logical in relation to the surface of the sculpture, because I just want to say again, these wormholes are the insect exiting, so they usually go in a certain direction. Does that answer the question?
Thank you so much, Val.
It's a good question.
So let's see the next slide maybe, or?
Yes. Yeah, let's go on to the next slide. I want to, in choosing the 4 sculptures that we chose, these are the last 2 remaining. So the falconer on the left and the seated figure is called Saint Fiacre. And Danielle and I picked these 2 because we knew that their paint was going to provide a lot of information that was going to be useful and interesting in an exhibition context, because the paint was going to tell a story, and a story that would kind of enhance the understanding of the pieces themselves. And they actually indeed did prove to be really interesting in terms of a paint history. And by way of explanation, the Saint Fiacre, which is on the right, you're seeing the front and the back, and the notation that you're seeing in the back in red and yellow. These are signs of where we were able to do paint analysis. So even when you're looking at the front and you think, there's no paint on this, in point of fact, there was quite a bit of paint and we were expecting to see that. And I can talk a little bit more about that maybe toward the end, but I kind of wanted to focus on the falconer because in many ways, this was kind of the outlier of the show, in part because, as you can see, it is not a saint. It's a secular figure, which is unusual in this genre to begin with. And 2, he's just kind of an intriguing fellow. Neither Danielle nor I could think of any pieces that really were comparable in terms of being sort of a fancy dressed figure who's not royal and who's not a saint. So if we could have the next slide, please. Oh, I think this is you, Danielle.
So this gets to my next question, actually. So another analytical tool that we use to learn more about these sculptures is XRF spectrometry. Our colleagues from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, Jess Kloros, who's actually pictured here, and Greta Yanis, joined us at the museum last fall to carry out this examination. And you can see actually Jess is holding an XRF spectrometer. And I was wondering, Valentine, if you could please explain what XRF spectrometry is, first of all, and why is it an important tool for conservators but also to talk a little bit about the results that we got from this analysis and what they told us about the works.
Yes, and I'll try, I'm not a physicist, so it's not going to be technical. So X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, or XRF spectroscopy, and we tend to shorthand the whole thing as XRF, is a technique that we like a lot in conservation because it's non-destructive. So if I could just explain what you're seeing in this image. So Jess Chloros is holding this this machine that says tracer on it up against the St. Ursula sculpture. And she's actually, I just want to be clear, she is making contact between the unit, the XRF unit, and the sculpture. And that's the closest we get to having to have direct contact with artwork. We try to avoid that a lot of the time with instrumental analysis, but in order for this technique to work, you have to kind of remove as much depth of air pocket as you can. So what that tracer unit is doing, what XRF spectroscopy is it is emitting energy, what we call radiant energy, in the X-ray spectrum. So just by comparison, light, visible light, the thing that we're using to see each other with now, is radiant energy in the visible light spectra. And but you can make choices. You can filter out light. If you think of a prism and how a prism shows you the rainbow, that's a form of filtration. And this tracer is a form of filtration in that it's selecting just energy in the X-ray range. And it is shooting it out, or what we call fluorescing it out, onto the sculpture, where there are pigments in the paint which are going to react to that highly filtered energy. And in turn, those pigments are going to fluoresce themselves. So the other thing the tracer is doing is it's sending out the X-ray, and then it's sensing the secondary fluorescence from the pigments. It is what we call a qualitative, not quantitative technique. It tells us about the presence of certain things. It does not tell us how much. Why is this good for the study of art? Well, X-ray fluorescence is really good at characterizing metal and metal compounds. And coincidentally, pigments that artists use tend to be or contain metals or metal compounds. So we can actually use it to characterize actual pigments that an artist has used. And you're already probably assuming, well, one of the good things about that is if pigments have a certain date of use, and many of them do, then you can often determine things like when something was painted or when something was restored. So that's kind of an explanation of the technique of X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. And there are other techniques that we use in conservation, lots of them, in fact. Many of them are non-destructive. Using the microscope is a really good way to study an object. I've already illustrated close examination and the use of ultraviolet light. And then there are also other techniques that we use that do require taking a sample. And if there's time at the end, I'm happy to talk about those. Next slide, please. So on the left, you're seeing the falconer again, and you're seeing that same notation about where we took all the samples. And I'm just pointing that out because when you do this kind of analysis, you want to be able to keep track of what you've sampled, because you're going to get different data for each of these numbers, presumably. And it's that data from that tracer unit that somebody like Jess Chloros, who was photographed, is going to analyze. So it's not just the raw data you want, you're going to have to go through a process of analysis of the raw data. We knew when we were looking at this piece that there were a number of things we were interested in studying. One was that kind of crazy checkerboard pattern on the falconer's tunic. Two was the likely possibility of overpaint, in part because the paint quality was very different over the whole sculpture. His face was in really good condition, whereas his tunic was kind of abraded and worn. We also noticed when we looked closely at certain parts of the sculpture, like the legs, you can see in the top right photo that there's a dark red paint that extends to almost the top of his boots, but then we see beneath another color, which suggests there was overpaint. And then when we looked at the two arms, we noticed that the sleeves were painted completely differently, which is also an indication of that there was probably some kind of restoration. Next slide, please. So focusing in on that checkerboard pattern, although it looks as if it's square blocks of black paint applied, we knew from close examination, as you can see in the top right slide, that it wasn't just simply squares of black paint. This is a photograph taken under low level magnification, but what you can see there, I think you can see, is a very clear pattern of leaves that are embossed or raised. And also, I don't know if you can see this, but it kind of looks like there's gold there, or at least some kind of metal. When we looked at the same squares under UV fluorescence, we also were seeing a lot of this green fluorescence selectively on the black squares, which is that green fluorescence is an indication of the presence of a resin, a natural resin or a varnish. Oh, I have a question from Riley Ames. Yes, there was treatment on these objects, which is kind of another conversation, but happy to pursue that maybe a little bit later. But yeah, they all required quite a bit of treatment. So just getting back to this ornamentation, what the X-ray fluorescence told us is that in fact these squares are not paint, but they are a thin sheet of tin metal, which has been embossed, and then it was gold leafed, and then it was varnished to protect that gold leaf. The black that you're seeing is actually a tin oxide. So it's the corrosion or the aging that make it look black. So originally his tunic probably was not black and white, but gold and white. Next slide, please. Oh, I got another question. So here's a question. Since these works are often touched, can you actually distinguish if an abrasion was done by manual touching or by something else? It has a lot to do with where the wear is. It's a good question, but cheeks, hands, feet, sometimes the breasts, the wounds of Christ, these are all places where you're looking for a lot of tactile impact. Danielle, do you have other thoughts about that?
I was just going to say those same locations.
Yeah. So usually that's kind of an indication that it's human interaction versus, packing or wear and tear or other things. Just a quick other note about, a discovery, that XRF provided was in the falconer's hood. We were seeing, you can see on the left, this kind of reticulated or alligatory-like red paint. In addition to that, a lot of preparation, which is kind of that preparation, that orange gold stuff is often what's left over from the preparation for gold leaf. And when I looked at it under UV, which you see on the right, again, we're seeing that green fluorescence. That's the presence of a varnish. There is a particular painting technique that's used where a painter mixes in varnish into the paint, the oil paint, to make it very transparent, and then paints that over a layer of gold leaf or metal leaf of some kind. The impact of that, the visual impact, is that it makes a very jewel-like or sparkly paint layer. in Italian, it's called Mecca. I don't know if it has names in other languages, but I had reason to think that that's what was going on. And the XRF analysis confirmed that there was gold leaf underneath this paint. We couldn't see any gold, but it seemed like that was what was going on. So that was really good to get that confirmation, and would have only have been possible through the XRF. So the analysis did provide a lot of insight. I think that's all I really, could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, I think that's all I really had to say about that.
I'll just add one more thing before we open it up to the floor, which is that this aspect of touch was really important for me, and something I wanted to explore more. It's maybe something people don't know as much about. So if you can just, let's see over this shoulder, that's the Saint Fiacre in the case, but on the wall is, as I said, a replica of the Saint Fiacre, which is the exact dimension. It's actually a 3D scan that we had made from the original that then my student researcher, Annalise Edwards, painted based on the XRF analysis, so that people could actually get a sense of the experience. It's actually weighted as well to be exactly the weight, the heft of the original work. So hopefully when you come to the exhibition, you can have that experience as well. So thank you so much. I think I'll open it up to the floor at this point. If there are any other questions, and maybe we can go back to the screen. Thank you. There we go. So we have one more follow-up question from Henriette. Does that mean that it had gold leaf? Was gold not used for more elevated subjects and not for a common falconer? If you want to address that.
Well, that's a good, I think you've just kind of pinpointed the process that somebody like Danielle has to go through when looking at something like this, because when the materials start getting cumulatively costly, but the subject is not necessarily one of veneration, how do you have to figure out how you're going to reconcile those two narratives. I imagine Danielle has some thoughts about it.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, it's the outlier of the show. It's the work we really we're not sure about much. We're not sure about culture. We're not sure about date. We really just don't know the original context. But as Valentine said, I think you just kind of take everything you can into consideration and try to piece it all together. But that's kind of the point of the show, is putting these things out there to see if we can also get some answers, as well as ask some questions. I just want to get to the Q&A. We have another follow-up about your treatment, if you'd be able to speak about that briefly.
Yeah, and actually that question ties in with the next question from David Dempsey, which I'm just going to say, he asked us, were there many pieces that were wax impregnated? So I'm going to get back to the first question about the treatment, but I'm going to start with that because wax impregnation, and thank you, David, for that question, is the single most typical treatment through the 19th and earlier part of the 20th century for these sculptures. And by wax impregnation, what that actually meant was for these sort of tabletop size sculptures, they were literally immersed into vats of melted wax and left there so that the wax could really penetrate into the wormholes, the areas of paint loss, the grain of the wood, any aperture. And then they were removed, and then they were meticulously solvent cleaned to take all the wax off the surface as much as possible to reveal the paint. And the reason this was done is because wood, even old wood, continues to react to the environment. So when the humidity goes up, wood, which is hygroscopic, takes moisture from the air in, and it physically expands. And then as the humidity goes down, the wood is going to release that moisture back out into the air. And when it does that, it contracts. So they're kind of moving over time. The wood has a certain level of plasticity, even old wood. Oil paint films do not. So every time this motion is happening, the paint is being stressed, and it usually exerts or it illustrates the stress in a form of breaking. And then when the wood contracts, the paint is brought back together, and often it'll do something called tenting, and then that paint is very vulnerable, tends to break off. So the wax impregnation was the way of trying to get into the wood to fill up all of its pores and interstices and cellular structure, so it stops taking moisture in and out. And when you do that, ideally, you're going to stabilize the paint. We don't do that anymore, and there are a number of reasons why, but it was a good idea at the time. And in many ways, it's preserved these sculptures for us today. The question was about treatment. So a lot of the treatment had to do with those conditions. One was dealing with the vulnerabilities of the paint that I just described, stabilizing it, and keeping whatever was there intact and reattaching it, which is kind of a very tedious, very micro kind of treatment, which is what earns conservators, I think, an undeserved reputation of being completely obsessive. But the other thing is that wax, even though they cleaned it off, it's still there, and it's soft, and it tends to pull dust and dirt in from the atmosphere, and it makes a completely dull appearance to these sculptures. So a lot of the treatment was also surface cleaning, trying to take down that wax a little without impacting negatively the paint that was there. So that's the treatment and the wax impregnation.
And I'll just say there's an area in the exhibition where you can watch a conservation video with clips from Valentine's treatment, where you actually see her in action, and that's also available on the exhibition website. So if we can just get to the next two, how can you tell the difference between cracks from a blow or impact and cracking from expansion and contraction of the wood from changes in relative humidity and temperature? I cannot answer that question.
You know, you can't always, but there's a couple of situations where you can. Cracks or damage in the wood that's associated with those insect exit holes. Remember, we looked at those insect exit holes, even though the infestation of the bug is no longer active, there aren't bugs still eating the wood. When they evacuate the sculpture, they leave these tunnels, and that actually leaves a lot of structural instability to the wood. The wood, which was previously quite solid, is now kind of this tubular network of wood, cellulose, and tunnels. And when those areas get impacted, hit, and it doesn't take a lot. Sometimes it's just recurrent vibration from like an air handling system in a building, just vibrating it regularly. You will see crush or breakage that's associated with that. Cracking, there are people who are better than me at identifying the different kinds of cracks. David Dempsey, who's here, is probably one of those people. But for example, a radial crack in wood has, it can be a combination of things. It can be impact related, but can also just be the aging of the wood. And because I said earlier, there's a certain amount of plasticity in the wood in terms of being able to contract and expand, but there's what we call a modulus of elasticity. So that that's if you looked at it on a graph, it would rise, it would rise, it would rise, and then it would stop. So there's a point at which if you keep forcing the wood to do this, it's going to finally say enough, and it will crack in response. And those crack patterns usually are parallel to the grain of the wood.
Thank you. All right, this is a nice question, perhaps to end on. So how did this wonderful research collaboration between our respective practices and institutions come about? So I'll just say we invited Valentine. We were so lucky that she agreed to come out and help us. We had a pre-existing relationship with her from a class she had taught here several years earlier, but it was really important, as I said earlier, to have an objects conservator, and to get Valentine was just kind of the cherry on top. So Valentine, if you want to say a little more about that.
Well, I want to say hi to Carrie. First of all, that's another conservator. Yeah, I think it's always a privilege to work closely with a curator, because I think conservation work is interesting in and of itself, but it's far more interesting when it's informed by the thought and experience and kind of range of insight that somebody like Danielle has. And it certainly informs the work that I do and that other conservators do. And it's also just a pleasure to work with Smith College Museum of Art.
So grateful. We have a few more minutes. So I'm going to keep going here. So you mentioned that the first piece had radial cracking that was probably from a blow. So I think that goes back.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I said blow. It may be too specific. I think it was due to impact. I think it was a mechanical impact of some kind, but that might not be necessarily like striking it. It might be, it could have been that it was restrained at one point in a frame that was a little tight. It could be, again, vibration. There are a number of could have been just torquing the panel a little bit. There are a lot of things. It's hard sometimes to deduce backwards what took place. I hope that answers it a little better.
And David Dempsey asks, the carving on the back of the circumcision was to remove excess wood, so that the wood would move less with change in RH or humidity. Were in the round pieces hollowed?
First of all, yes, thank you, David. That is exactly correct. The removal of excess wood and making a thinner support, just as you described. So none of these pieces were hollowed out. I will say that in the case of the falconer, it's a little difficult to know for sure, because we do know that its space has been restored. But I will say it appeared that it would be the opposite of that. It was actually built up. It was the base of the falconer had, I believe, 10 joined pieces of wood. So making the wood denser probably added to some of the stability. And the other thing that I would say that I would have been looking for on something like the Ursula as a way of combating the impact of changes in relative humidity, which is a form of ambient humidity, is that on relief panels, like with painted panels, if you go back and you read primary sources, at least in Italian primary sources, the artists are told in the 15th and 16th century, whatever you do on the front of the panel, you should do on the back of the panel. So if you're going to seal, gesso, and paint the front, seal, gesso, and paint the back. You don't have to do it fancy, but do it the same, because you want to reduce differential intake on the two sides of the work of art. So it was interesting to me that the Ursula wasn't treated that way. It was, however, it was lime wood, which is dimensionally pretty stable, and it was quite thick. So it had held up, I thought, extremely well. Also, that wax impregnation helped a lot too.
Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate that these are all things that have been cut out of larger contexts. So there's already, stress kind of a priori that just kind of will continue from there on. But I'm afraid we have to stop there. It's 12:59. So I think I will turn it back to my colleagues, but just want to say thank you, Valentine, and thank you all for your participation and wonderful questions. We appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say a huge thank you to Danielle and Valentine for being with us today. And thank you all so much for your fantastic questions. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, for anyone who's local, we do have an in-person tour this weekend with our contemporary curator, Emma Chubb. So encourage you to join us for that. I just shared the registration in the link. And also sign up for our newsletter if you haven't yet. If you're not on our mailing list, stay in touch with us. We are going to be having some exciting programs coming up in the spring around this exhibition, including a musical performance by the Smith Chamber Choir and another virtual program. So I just want to thank you so much, Danielle and Valentine. This is so fantastic. Thank you to my colleague Lauren for slide sharing, and thank you to everyone for the really exciting questions and engagement with today's program. We hope to see you soon in person or online, and we will look forward to more in the coming months with this exhibition. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon. Take care.